Hi, happy Father's Day to everyone except for Filbrick Pines and Preston Northwest. This year, Father's Day happens to land on June 18th, 618, the Gravity Falls number. Preston Northwest and Filbrick Pines are two father characters in the series Gravity Falls, and they are some of the most hated characters in the Gravity Falls fandom. And I want to talk about why, but I also want to talk about the way that Gravity Falls approaches the topic of abusive fatherhood, what it does right in its discussion of it, and where it drops the ball. I also want to look at how the fandom, the people who make the fan art and the fan fiction and the theories and kind of keep this community alive, interact with these characters. Because I think it reveals something about the way that we interact with media. Before we dive in, I'm just gonna say, I love this show. I am analyzing this show as someone who really enjoys looking at details and picking stuff apart. This isn't gonna be a critique of Gravity Falls as much as it is an analysis. But if you're not the type of person who enjoys really looking at these stupid little details and analyzing them for greater meaning, then this might not be the video for you, and that's fine. Also, not all of the father characters in the series Gravity Falls that we're gonna talk about today are horrible people, but at least a couple of them are, so I guess trigger warning for discussions of abuse and abusive fatherhood and abusive parenthood in general, if that's something that upsets you. Now, this video is going to be analyzing how the themes of abuse and neglect show up in both the audience's interaction with the series and the series itself, and how those opinions differ. So I'm going to begin with a really easy one and talk about Soos's dad, because everyone agrees that Soos's dad sucks and is abusive and neglectful. Both the show and the audience think that to be the case, which is something that doesn't necessarily apply to Filbrick and Preston. So seeing how the show addresses a cut and dry instance of shitty parenting seems like a good baseline to approach the topic. Soos's character is handled throughout the series as this kind of comic relief guy who's perpetually a little bit childish, but at the end of the day, harmless and lovable. The way that Soos is handled can sometimes bother me in Gravity Falls. I mean, there seem to be a few underlying visual jokes about his body, and I don't know, it bugs me. I don't know if I'm a fan of that. There's also a couple of jokes dedicated to how dumb and clumsy he is, and also an entire episode dedicated to that latter one. And they seem to undercut it with this thing that Bill says.
You're a lot more clever than you look, especially the fat one.
Soos knows more than he seems.
I think Soos knows less than he seems.
But I do love Soos as a person, and he seems to be just an absolute sweetheart. If Stan is the brains behind a Mystery Shack, Soos is the heart, and I think we can all agree on that. That being said, at the end of the day, the show doesn't really seem to take Soos very seriously as a character. But one episode where I would argue he is most taken seriously is Blendon's Game. Blendon's Game is about the kids competing against Blendon Blandon in Globnar, an interdimensional futuristic space fight. But really what it's about is Soos unpacking the trauma that he feels from his father abandoning him at a young age. We're shown that growing up, Soos's dad was never there. He never showed up on his birthday, and every time he promised to show up, he would just send a postcard saying, "Maybe next year, kid." As a result, Soos has an amount of trauma, or at least emotional damage, that he needs to unpack from all of this. It's actually refreshing to see the show take him seriously, even if, like his father, the showrunners forgot his birthday in Journal 3. Just saying. But we do see firsthand the impact that his dad never showing up had on him. Whereas Soos is typically affable and fun and excitable, throughout this whole episode, he's somber. The weight of being abandoned by his dad has a heft to it that we can definitely detect. The show also implies pretty heavily that is why he sees Grunkle Stan as a father figure. It's because his dad is a piece of garbage who abandoned him. His dad sucks. His dad is the worst. Fuck Soos's dad. All my homies hate Soos's dad. And you know what? The fandom agrees, because I've seen tons of fics where Soos is somberly saying that Mr. Pines is the closest thing to a father he's ever had. I've seen fics where Stan punches Soos's dad in the face when Soos's dad comes around for money. I've seen fics where Mr. Pines adopts Soos. The fandom understands that this guy is trash, and that no matter what, there is real pain felt by his abandonment. I just want to put a pin in that. So, we have our baseline. We know what shitty fatherhood looks like in Gravity Falls. And now I'm gonna move on to another character, Fiddleford McGucket. Fiddleford is one of the only other parents in the series that we see, and he's also one of the most singularly tragic figures in all of Gravity Falls. The way his story is told is kind of out of order, because we're introduced to him in the series, like in the summer that the show takes place in the 2010s, but we later find out the real meat of his story in 1982. But his first episode is actually about his relationship with Tate, his son, which is something that I think a lot of people forget. He was introduced first and foremost as a dad. The story is about Dipper and Mabel tracking down a sea monster, but really it's about him wanting respect from his son, wanting his son to pay attention to him again, because as he says it, no one pays attention to you when you get older.
But why did you do it?
Well, when you get to be an old fella like me, nobody pays any attention to you anymore. My own son hasn't visited me in months. So I figured maybe I'd catch his fancy with a 15-ton aquatic robot.
It's supposed to be kind of tragic, but the show also really plays it as just kind of funny.
In retrospect, it seems a bit contrived.
He's a divorcee with a penchant for man-eating robots, and he just wants his son to stop being ashamed of him. And that's kind of the tone that they apply to McGucket. It's, rife with a lot of classist Appalachian stereotypes, and also a lot of jokes about him living in a dump, which, I don't know if that's great, but we're not talking about that here. But then we get his backstory in both Journal 3 and the episode Society of the Blind Eye. And we get a look at this young, happy father who had just had a son, and he agrees to go to bumfuck nowhere, Oregon on a pipe dream project. And his reasons for doing this are implied in the journal to be more financially viable and give his family a better life. But after facing intense bouts of trauma, both in the Gremlin incident described in the journal, where he looked into the eyes of the Gremlin and saw his worst fears and had seemingly horrible anxiety after that, and also an incident where he got his head stuck in the interdimensional portal that he was working on with Stanford Pines, McGucket invents a memory gun to erase his mind of all of the traumatic things that he sees. He thinks he's genuinely, doing a good thing. He even designed it with an output jack, which I think implies that he meant for this to be used on a wide scale to help people, which Ford says is terrifying, because it kind of is. So he initially starts using it to cope, but he uses it again and again and again and again until it ruins his life. The allegory for addiction is easy to see, and this isn't a revelation, people have been pointing this out since the episode aired. After all, he is abusing this method because he wants to forget and not think about what he's been through. He also seems to be continually using it while working for Ford for a few months, at least going by the events in the journal. And the way that Ford doesn't even notice could be seen as Fiddleford being some kind of the memory gun equivalent of a functioning alcoholic. But he overuses it, and eventually he loses himself completely, losing his mind for 30 years. He forgets his history, his identity, everything it seems but his son. And I know that because his son is one of the only things he remembers, at least going by the episode Legend of the Gobblewonker. To be clear, this first episode was very much it has this retcon treatment to it, because it was not made while they knew what McGucket's backstory was gonna be. McGucket's backstory was designed for season 2. Going by the DVD commentary, a lot of elements of the show were not set in stone until season 2, which makes it incredible that it works so well. This show was held together with chewing gum, prayer, and a lot of hard work, and I really respect that about the series. But yeah, McGucket's backstory is retcon to hell. He was definitely just going to be a joke character. His original name was going to be Crazy Larry, according to the commentary, but SMP said no. And listen, SMP isn't always right, but a stopped clock is right twice a day. But the retcon works, and it adds a layer of tragedy, because through it all you need to wonder, wait, if Fiddleford comes from Palo Alto, California, where he left his young son and wife behind, then why is Tate in Gravity Falls? The show didn't think about these things, but it's one of those conclusions that we need to fill in. It seems to me, at least, that Tate probably tracked down his dad when he was older, or at least that they had to move up to Gravity Falls when he was younger to find his dad, because his dad had forgotten. But if Tate did go up there when he was older, or even if he went there when he was younger, this still applies, that means that he saw his dad without any memory of him, or at least with very little memory of his past life. He saw his dad seemingly ravaged by the impacts of this addiction, and he went up there possibly to try to help him. And that is a lot for a child of a parent to go through. Seeing your father unravel like that in a way that isn't dissimilar to the impacts of addiction or the impacts of dementia in this case, mean that this isn't just McGucket's tragedy, it's also Tate's. So I want to be clear. I know that McGucket is in this video, and this video talks a lot about abusive fatherhood, but I don't think that McGucket is abusive. I also don't think that addiction is a moral failing. I think that addiction is an illness. I think that addiction needs treatment, not criminalization. But addiction does cause harm, both to the person who has the addiction and also to their family and loved ones. That's why it needs to be treated with sympathy and empathy and ways that work. And I think that Tate definitely feels some of that harm. But the fact that in episode 2 he's treating his dad so coldly might mean that he's now shutting out McGucket. It might mean that he's not able to help him beyond what he has done. It might mean that there's this underlying resentment and frustration that isn't just people don't pay attention to old people anymore. Like, it seems like there's something deeper there. Even though McGucket is shown in this episode to be actively trying to have his son back in his life, offering to play catch. That's what dads do. They play catch. That's the one thing I know about fatherhood, is that they play catch. I'll also say that going by this one short, it seems that Tate at least knows not to talk a lot about what is going on in Gravity Falls.
Bit of friendly advice, boy. You see bubbles on that lake, run.
What? Why?
Enough questions. Get that camera out of here.
Like, I don't know if this is confirmation that he knows about the Society of the Blind Eye, the cult that now goes around erasing memories because McGucket started a cult. Remember how McGucket started a cult? That's not what this video is about, but what the fuck? But regardless, Tate might know about that, which means that he might know why his dad is the way that he is. All I know is that Tate is living in the same town as his dad, and that his dad is currently, at least at the start of the series, starting sea monster hoaxes at the lake that Tate works at. Tate makes a living selling fishing bait on this lake, and his dad is making up sea monsters. That's not cool. And I understand McGucket's penchant for, like, chaotic solutions to problems, and that goes way before he even erased his mind. Like, read the journal. He's always been like this. But the idea that he's lying and making stuff up to get attention from his son, I don't know if I like that. A lot of people have parents that do that. And it's not cool. It at least makes Tate, to me, a lot more sympathetic. And I have a bigger idea of what he himself is going through with the added context of the Society of the Blind Eye arc. And I know that we still feel sympathy for McGucket because we know what McGucket has been through. We know that McGucket was dealing with this, unlike Soos's dad, who was, I don't know, partying in New Orleans and willingly left his son behind. But let's say hypothetically that Soos's dad wasn't partying in New Orleans. Let's say Soos's dad was sick and unable to visit, or he was on a business trip, or he was kidnapped and thrown somewhere for 30 years and he was unable to see his kid. Even if Soos's dad went through something, it wouldn't undo what Soos has gone through. It wouldn't erase the years that Soos had to go without a father figure. Even if we love McGucket, that doesn't mean that we can't feel sympathy for Tate. I think the fandom has kind of like agreed, like, yeah, Tate went through a lot. It must have been really tough on him. But the series seems to have a different opinion. The journal has this passage where Ford and Fiddleford are sitting down after Fiddleford has gotten his memories back, and Ford specifically says that Fiddleford told him how his family turned their backs on him. If Fiddleford's family just turned their backs on him, then what is Tate doing in Gravity Falls? Did he move to Gravity Falls so he could turn his back on his dad closer? The show doesn't give this arc the weight that I think it really deserves. After all, what Tate went through can't be ignored. From episode 1, Tate is being shown as being uncaring for his dad for being old, instead of the full-on complex situation, which is that Tate was, at least from his perspective, left behind at a young age, that his dad wasn't really able to be in his life, and that he's dealing with the emotional complexities of that while also understanding that there might be a cult in Gravity Falls erasing memories. The show simply doesn't have a lot of interest in showing Tate's perspective or the complexities on how the addiction allegory or the dementia allegory way into all this. Which is an oversight on the show's part, because if you're going to touch on these themes, you can't boil it down to McGucket is crazy now and Tate turned his back, and they just need to talk it out. They tell McGucket to talk it out twice. Once in episode 2.
Did you ever talk to your son about how you felt?
No, sir, I got to work straight on the robot.
And again in the journal.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
And I don't know, I just don't like the phrasing of they turned their backs on him. McGucket's story is one of the most resonant in the series, like, right after Stan and Ford's. I relate to what McGucket is going through in ways that I can't really resonate with, like, with the kids' stories, because I'm grown. But if Soos and his father's story tells us something about neglect, then this story tells us about how difficult it is to fix relationships that have been broken. McGucket was introduced as nothing more than a one-note, crazy, unhoused Appalachian person stereotype. But I think that the series does a disservice to Tate, because if it's going to address an addiction metaphor, then kind of implying that the family just turned their backs on the person who has the addiction doesn't sit well with me. But enough about McGucket for now. I have a video on him planned in the future. Let's bring in the next dad. So, I am concerned for Pacifica. We don't see a lot about Preston Northwest, but everything we do see bugs me a lot. In season 2, he tells his 12-year-old that Northwests don't lose, and then he seemingly forgets to pick her up again after the mini golf game. She has it in her head that high standards are what make the Northwest family great, and she is expected to meet them. And in the episode The Northwest Mansion Mystery, she is shown to be explicitly afraid of her parents.
Why are you so afraid of your parents?
You wouldn't understand.
She listens to their every word. And the reason why she listens is shown to be because of the bell.
Yes, Father.
Yeah, it seems like her parents have her conditioned to respond to a bell. This child is not okay, right? Well, Alex seems to think she's fine. This is what Alex Hirsch said in an interview to Mary Sue shortly after the series ended.
Two things, purely to satisfy my curiosity as a fan. A, did Pacifica stay with her parents post-series? It seemed like a seriously bad situation, guardianship-wise.
I think a lot of fans read more than I meant into the awfulness of Pacifica's parents. I never imagined them as being abusive, just very controlling, living vicariously through their daughter, treating her like a prize more than a person. Pacifica is still only a kid, so I think she'd continue to live with them, but I think she'd start to have a very needed rebellious phase to discover who she is outside of her family name.
She's flinching, Alex. She's physically fighting the impulse to respond to the bell. I find it strange that Alex doesn't say that this is abuse. I mean, I'm not here to talk about Alex Hirsch. I don't know the guy. I've never spoken to the guy. And we are not in the business on this channel of psychoanalyzing people that we do not know. Like, I do not know why Alex said that this isn't abuse. But I do personally think it is odd and can't understand how someone can look at this and think that this is, like, not abusive parenting. At least for me. I also wanted to add that the second half of this first part of the quote, the idea that Pacifica's parents are living vicariously through their daughter, treating her like a prize more than a person, that to me feels like abuse. Maybe not physical abuse, but definitely emotional abuse. Objectifying their daughter as an extension of their own reputation feels like something that at least should be addressed in therapy. And I would argue that this kind of behavior can't correctly be categorized as just being controlling or just being strict. Alex, my guy, strict parents don't command their children around with bells. I'm the child of immigrants, right? My parents are strict. And this isn't to say that all immigrant parents are strict, but mine certainly were. And let me tell you, as strict as they were, I was never operantly conditioned with a bell. Honestly, at this point, just beat her. It's more humane. Or it's at least gotta be better than Skinner boxing your child. In the comics, we see the lengths that Pacifica is willing to go through to meet the expectations put on her by her parents. I mean, don't even get me started on Priscilla Northwest reading the ugly duckling to her child, but like, instead of the full story, it's the equivalent of like, the ugly barnacle story that Patrick tells SpongeBob.
Once there was an ugly barnacle. He was so ugly that everyone died. The end.
It makes me wonder if the writers involved in this episode just didn't consider emotional abuse to be real abuse. Or again, if they didn't recognize the signs of emotional abuse looking at their writing from the outside. Maybe they thought that conditioning her with a bell would be like too wacky to really be perceived as any kind of metaphor for actual abuse, but it wasn't wacky enough because we all went, is Pacifica okay? I mean, just look at this. Like, replace the bell with a shaking fist. It wouldn't pass SMP if Preston held up a shaking fist at Pavlov Northwest over here. After all, when you operantly condition animals with like a bell or a sound or something, a lot of times it's because of electric shock therapy. I mean, obviously we're looking too deeply into it. I am not saying that Pacifica's parents electrocute their child, but I am saying that if you told me they did, that if Alex Hirsch visited me and said, oh yeah, they absolutely do, I would not be surprised. So it's fascinating to me that the lead writer of the show doesn't think that this qualifies as abuse. After all, it resulted in the second most hated Gravity Falls dad of all time. But now, it's time to talk about hated dad number 1. So Filbrick Pines' views on masculinity, toughness, providing for one's family, and what it means to be worthwhile and impressive would shape Stanley and Stanford Pines for the rest of their adult lives. We're going to be talking a lot about Stan in this section for very obvious reasons, but I don't want you to think that Ford also wasn't impacted by this upbringing. I mean, Ford is someone who thinks that he needs to go to great lengths to the highest pinnacle of scientific achievement just to be impressive. This is a man who says he's afraid of returning home a freak instead of a hero. This is a man who calls anxiety childish despite obviously suffering from it himself. This is a man who still thinks about Kathy Crenshaw from the 3rd grade. He doesn't just have issues, he is a ball of issues held together with some other stuff. Maybe if he had a good childhood, he wouldn't be so desperate to impress an Illuminati-eye in a top hat. And he probably wouldn't have this martyr complex that we see in him trying to fix his mistake. But let's really talk about the impact that Filbrick had on Stan, because that's what we see more of in the series, going back to the episode Dreamscapers. In this episode, we see that Stan was bullied a lot as a kid, and his dad signed him up for boxing lessons, basically forcing him to take them. He said that he thought his dad hated him. More on this later. But at the end of the day, his dad didn't hate him, he thinks. His dad was doing him a favor.
You know, at the time, I thought my pop was trying to torture me. But wouldn't you know it, the old man was doing me a favor all along.
And on surface level, I don't think this is too bad of a reflection of Filbrick. If my kid was going to a school or lived in an area or was in circumstances where he was getting his ass kicked, I might sign him up for boxing lessons or taekwondo or something too. And if you don't agree with that, I don't know. Criticize my hypothetical parenting skills in the comments below. But we get other looks at his dad. I mean, one that comes to mind is in his commentary in the DVD, Stan says, "Dad always taught me that the way to get people to respect you is to punch the biggest person in the room."
But if you do that in school, you know, then apparently you have rage problems, quote unquote, according to the counselor.
We also have this line in Little Shop of Horrors.
Movies are great. You watch the movie, you scare the girl snuggles up next to you, next thing you know, you gotta raise a kid, your life falls apart. Forget that last part.
And when people were like, wait, does this mean that Stan is a dad? Alex Hirsch was like, no. Those are things that his dad said about him. What these things do is paint a picture of a father who taught his kids to be aggressive, who constantly belittled them and told them that they made him miserable, and who is very hesitant to dole out praise or any kind of sign that he's impressed. On top of this is the fact that both Stanley and Stanford were named Stan because Filbrick couldn't be fucked to think of another name. This isn't your typical case of giving twins matchy names because it's cute. He just genuinely didn't want to think of another one. And that's not even talking about the science fair incident. In A Tale of Two Stands, Filbrick is described as tough as a cinder block and impossible to impress. The closest thing we see to him being impressed is when it is mentioned that Ford might end up being a millionaire by going to this college.
Your son may be a future millionaire, Mr. Pines.
I'm impressed.
Which, don't like that. Like, he is notably not impressed with Ford's, scientific achievement. He is impressed with Ford's ability to get money. And then, when Stan and Ford fight because Stan accidentally breaks the science fair project that gets Ford not admitted into West Coast Tech, Filbrick throws him out on the street, specifically citing that it's because he cost the family millions.
Well, this time you cost our family potential millions. And until you make us a fortune, you're not welcome in this household.
What?
There is no charitable interpretation of what Filbrick is doing here. He sees his kids as a meal ticket, he throws his kid out on the streets, and he basically explicitly tells Stan that he isn't worth anything to him if he doesn't make money, which goes on to follow Stan for the rest of his life. And that's not even counting the practical impacts of homelessness and being homeless for over 10 fucking years. He had to live out of his car. He had to join the mob. And Stan even knows that he has issues. He has a book called Daddy Issues. In the finale of the series, Stan has this conversation with Ford. When he and Ford are drinking 100% pure 180 proof water from this canteen. He says, "Dad was right about me. I am a screw up."
Kids are gonna die and it's all my fault because I couldn't shake your stupid hand. Dad was right about me. I am a screw up.
And then at the end of the episode, when he basically gives up his life to stop Bill and save his family, he says this.
Guess I was good for something after all.
And these words are sad. But the show never really unpacks this. It never really unpacks the impact of what Filbrick did to Stan. And one of the reasons it doesn't do this is probably because Stan and Ford don't have the emotional tools to unpack it. Because Stan's an old guy and he doesn't believe in eye doctors, let alone therapy. They're gonna go on a boat and have an adventure, and Stan's gonna fuck a mermaid or something, but at the end of the day, Stan's going to think that he is on this adventure with his brother because he finally proved his worth. Not because he was worthy all along. And that comes back to Filbrick Pines. Mike Rianda says in the DVD commentary for Dreamscapers that Stan's issues literally stem from him being a kid. The other look we have at Stan and Ford as children is in the Lost Legends comic, The Jersey Devil's in the Details. Yeah, the comic is about Stan and Ford hunting down the Jersey Devil, but the crux of this comic is that Stan thinks his father hates him, and that he's the stupid twin. And Ford reassures him that it's fine. And look, at the end, the comic seems to agree with Ford. He's rough around the edges, but Filbrick is smiling at the thing that his kid stole, and it seems like he loves his kid at the end anyways. And I remember people being angry, angrier than the Mabel's fault line in Don't Dimension It. But I remember people saying that this seems to imply that everything that Filbrick did to his sons, despite it all, he loved them. And it seems like the comic wants that to absolve some of our angry feelings about this. The comic is like, look, he loves his boys. And I'm like, does he? Look at the scene. Filbrick is grabbing Stan by the collar. Stan is seemingly terrified. He's being tossed out on the street like a sack of trash. My first impulse is to say that these two guys, the dad in Lost Legends and the dad in A Tale of Two Stands, are different men. But if I'm trying to defend the comic, which we'll get to the other side later, but if I'm trying to defend the comic, I would say that most parents, even abusive parents, love their kids. That's one of the things that makes abuse so painful. It comes from people often who love us. Abusive parenting is complicated. It isn't they're not all like Gaara's uncle in Naruto where he's like, I hate you, your mama hated you, everyone hated you, just die. And I think a shortcoming of a lot of media with abusive characters is that they depict abuse like that. Just pure evil, no love, no complication, no nuance. But that's not what abuse looks like in most cases. And I think that a lot of the shows that Disney has right now that are considered to be Gravity Falls' modern contemporaries, like Owl House, Amphibia, etc., handle abusive characters a lot better. Like, Sasha is Anne's friend, but she's also shown to be manipulative and rude and bossy and abusive. But they're still friends. There are still good times with that. In Owl House, yeah, Balos is awful to Hunter and abusive and terrible, but not every word out of his mouth is how much he hates the kid. In fact, he seems to say a lot of encouraging things. He tells Hunter that he just thinks he could do better, and Hunter's like, yeah, this father figure thinks I can do better. So, what is Gravity Falls doing with the Lost Legends comic? What is it doing with this panel with Filbrick smiling at his son's gift? Is it trying to say that Filbrick is a multifaceted man and that abuse is complicated? Well, I don't know, because the same complexity isn't really awarded to Preston or to Tate and Fiddleford. It makes me unsure how to feel about this. This panel just makes me feel uncomfortable. And to this day, I don't know if that's on purpose. We need to consider the possibility that Filbrick, like Preston, isn't supposed to be abusive, but we think he is. Like, maybe the series thinks that this is just tough love. Yeah, well, tough love or not, it trickles into every interaction that Stan has with the people that he considers to be his children. Stan doesn't care about child labor laws. He's so dependent on the need to make money that he underpays his employees, including his son figure, Soos. He hires Soos as child labor. He forces Soos to sleep in this closet with steaming hot pipes and seemingly doesn't care. And with Dipper and Mabel, he gets the kids thrown in jail. He sells Mabel in episode 4. In the DVD commentary for Dreamscapers, which I keep going back to, Mike Rianda says that this episode teaches why Stan is so hard on Dipper. And he is hard on Dipper. Throughout the series, he openly mocks Dipper, his masculinity, his interests. And in this episode specifically, what we see is him forcing Dipper to fight a bat in the kitchen, and Dipper actually gets injured. And he specifically asked Dipper to do it and not Mabel, which seems, gendered. Or maybe he just thinks that Dipper is weaker than Mabel. Dipper says that the more difficult or painful the chore is, the more likely he is to pick Dipper to do it. And then he says this.
Sometimes I feel like Stan hates me.
And we're not supposed to think that Stan hates Dipper. The show makes us come to the conclusion at the end of this episode that Stan is making Dipper miserable because he loves him. And because it echoes what Stan says about his father, are we supposed to think the same thing about Filbrick? That despite everything, Filbrick really loved Stan and was doing him a favor? I think that if your friend approached you saying, yeah, my dad makes me fight off bats in the kitchen, but it's just to toughen me up because I'm such a little bitch. Like, you would be upset. You would be concerned. You would be like, are you okay? Something even more concerning is this quote that Stan says about things he heard growing up.
The kid's a loser. He's weak. He's an utter embarrassment. I just want to get rid of him.
Who said that about you, Stan? Because I think I know who. It's always bothered me that the show inherently assumes that this treatment of Dipper is something that we should appreciate. Like, we're supposed to appreciate that he has Dipper do all these mundane chores and that he's always mocking him. Appreciate that he hits him with the newspaper as he sends him off to do manual labor. It's like he's trying to reteach Dipper the toxic masculinity that Dipper unlearned in Dipper vs. Manliness. Oh, all this? It's actually because Stan actually really loves him. And, he's really proud of him.
He's really coming along. When push comes to shove, I'm actually proud of him. Just don't ever tell him that.
Oh yeah, you wouldn't want him to think that you're impressed with him. At the end of the day, I understand why Stan treats Dipper like this. He's an old guy from the 60s. Obviously shaped by that experience and by the parenting that he had as a kid. I have defended Stan's actions in this episodes, as part of the narrative to my friends. I don't think that they're good actions, but I think it is good character writing that he takes them, because it feels true to who he is. I do believe that Stan, given where he came from, given the time he lived through, and given who his father was, would act like this to a child. So it is good writing. Where the show falls flat for me in this episode is that the narrative seems to agree with Stan. The show thinks, yeah, it's true. Dipper is a little bitch, and he does need to be manned up. So yeah, I don't trust that the comic panel is about showing that abuse comes from multifaceted people. I think they want us to appreciate Filbrick because they've done that before. By the way, Ford is not without fault here as far as like being a parent figure. And I'm not just talking about the crossbow, like it's fine to give weapons to children thing. No. I don't care about that. How about the whole show no emotion or fear Dipper thing?
They're security droids and they detect adrenaline. You simply have to not feel any fear and they won't see you.
Ford is just like, don't show any emotion. Show no fear. Don't let them in. Don't let them see. Be the good girl that you always have to be. Oh, Dipper, you have anxiety? How about just turn it off like a light switch? It's a nifty little 60s New Jersey trick. And then when Dipper is able to do this, the show treats it like that was a solid piece of advice. Like the show acts like Dipper really did something here. Like he grew and developed and is now a braver person. Because he was able to physically bypass his natural fear response and keep his blood pressure down. Both Grunkle Ford and the episode's narrative are like, you did it, kid. You finally learned repression. Just like me. Good job. You know the thing that happens when shows are written by cis men? You know, I actually commend the show for writing realistic characters. And I think that scrubbing them of their flaws would just be dishonest. I just wish that the show's narrative didn't act like these parenting techniques were healthy or fine. Because they're not. The way that the Stans happen to treat these kids happen to be one of the most poignant, unintentional examples of how generational trauma works. The Stans came from this environment, and it's the only way that they know how to be. And you probably can argue, if you really wanted to, that Filbrick probably has trauma of his own, maybe from his own parents. And if you really wanted to go full Gravity Falls theory, you can look at the link that we get from the comics that goes to the secret website that implies that Filbrick was either a Jewish immigrant or the son of a Jewish immigrant who arrived in America before 1950, a very notable and loaded time to be a Jewish immigrant in the United States. He's probably been through a lot, but whatever he's been through, it doesn't undo the complexes that the Stans now obviously have. And I know this, but I wish that the series knew it too. So, thank you for sticking with me through this video. It's kind of a heavy one. Abuse is complicated. You know, I might one day have kids, and if I've learned anything from a 2012 Disney show, it's not to condition them with a bell. Also, this is the last video in a multi-video series on Gravity Falls, like analysis videos that I put on my channel, the week of 6/18, the Gravity Falls number. So, I'm lying here when I say this. I still have at least one more video. It had some delays, but it will be out. It's gonna come out next week. Also, I keep forgetting to mention this, but I have a Patreon. It is the best way to support me as I make videos that I think will be 10 to 20 minutes long, which end up being about an hour. I also have some exclusive content up there, including at least one exclusive Patreon video at any given time. Also, when I reach 50 patrons, I'm going to give myself an Inkbox version of the All-Star tattoo. That's right, the All-Star tattoo. It's an Inkbox tattoo, so it'll only last a few weeks, but I will still have this on the side of my neck for 2 weeks. Thank you. So yeah, happy Father's Day to all the dads out there. For the last time this week, this is Hannah Hyperfixates, signing off.